What happens when humanity's greatest protector becomes its most terrifying threat? Omni-Man appeared to be Earth's perfect guardian, a loving father, devoted husband, and unwavering hero. But beneath that cape lay a mind shaped by millennia of conquest and ideology. Tonight, we dive into the psychology of a being who can justify the elimination of entire civilizations while tucking his son into bed. The question isn't just what he became, it's how long he was hiding in plain sight. To understand Omni-Man, we must first understand Viltrum, a world that didn't just create warriors, but engineered the perfect psychological framework for galactic domination. The Viltrumite Empire wasn't built on random violence. It was constructed on a carefully cultivated superiority complex that would make any psychologist's head spin. Nolan Grayson wasn't born evil. He was born into a society that had spent thousands of years perfecting what we might call structured supremacy. Imagine growing up in a world where your entire culture revolves around a single principle. Strength determines worth. Not strength of character, not emotional resilience, but pure physical dominance over other beings. From childhood, Viltrumites are conditioned through what psychologists call operant conditioning, a system where behaviors are reinforced through rewards and punishments. But in Viltrum's case, the reward for strength was literally the right to exist, while weakness resulted in elimination. This creates what we know as survival-based identity formation, where your entire sense of self becomes tied to maintaining dominance over others. The brilliance of Viltrumite psychology lies in how it combines narcissistic personality traits with collectivist ideology. Nolan didn't just believe he was superior as an individual. He believed his entire species was evolutionarily destined to rule. This is what psychologists call group narcissism, where the ego extends beyond the self to encompass an entire identity group. What makes this particularly insidious is how it creates cognitive immunity to empathy. When you genuinely believe that other species are inferior, not just different, but fundamentally lesser, their suffering doesn't register as morally significant. It's like asking someone to feel guilty about stepping on ants. But here's what nobody saw coming. Nolan's assignment to Earth wasn't just about conquest. It was about to become the ultimate psychological experiment. What happens when an apex predator is forced to live among those he considers prey? 20 years. For 2 decades, Nolan Grayson lived a lie so complete that it began to reshape the very foundations of his identity. What started as a simple reconnaissance mission became the most complex psychological transformation in fictional literature, and the most dangerous. The human brain is remarkably adaptable, but Viltrumite minds are even more so. When Nolan first arrived on Earth, his mission was clear: integrate weakened planetary defenses and prepare for invasion. Simple, clinical, emotionally sterile. But something unprecedented happened. He began forming genuine attachments. Debbie Grayson wasn't just cover. She became what psychologists call an attachment figure. For the first time in his centuries of existence, Nolan experienced what humans call unconditional love. Not the conditional respect of Viltrumite hierarchy, not the fear-based loyalty of conquered subjects, but genuine emotional connection based on who he was, not what he could do to others. Then came Mark. Fatherhood activated neural pathways in Nolan's brain that had been dormant for centuries. The protective instincts, the pride in watching his child grow, the genuine joy in shared experiences, these weren't part of his mission. They were biological and psychological responses that began rewiring his fundamental worldview. Here's where it gets psychologically fascinating. Nolan was experiencing what we call cognitive dissonance, the mental stress of holding contradictory beliefs. Part of him genuinely loved his human family, while another part maintained his Viltrumite programming. The human mind resolves this conflict through rationalization, but Nolan's solution was far more complex. He began compartmentalizing his emotions, creating what psychologists term dissociative barriers between his human connections and his Viltrumite identity. During family dinners, he was genuinely Nolan the father. During Guardian missions, he was authentically the protector of humanity. But deep down, the Viltrumite imperative remained dormant, not destroyed. The trigger came when Mark's powers manifested. Suddenly, Nolan couldn't separate his roles anymore. His son wasn't just human. He was half Viltrumite, a bridge between two worlds that couldn't coexist in Nolan's fractured psyche. And that's when everything began to collapse. The human mind possesses a terrifying ability. It can justify almost anything if the psychological pressure is strong enough. What we witnessed in Nolan's transformation wasn't madness. It was the methodical reconstruction of moral reasoning under extreme cognitive stress. When Nolan received his reactivation orders, he faced what psychologists call a moral injury, a situation where your fundamental values collide with unavoidable circumstances. Most people break under this pressure, but Nolan didn't break. He adapted, and that adaptation was far more chilling than any psychotic break could have been. He began employing what we recognize as moral disengagement, a set of psychological mechanisms that allow people to deactivate their moral standards without experiencing guilt or self-condemnation. First came moral justification, convincing himself that Viltrumite rule would ultimately benefit humanity, even if the transition required temporary unpleasantness. Then came euphemistic labeling, the careful choice of words that sanitize horrific actions. Nolan didn't talk about destroying civilizations. He spoke of bringing order. He didn't discuss eliminating the weak. He talked about evolutionary necessity. This linguistic restructuring is how ordinary people become capable of extraordinary cruelty. But the most insidious mechanism was dehumanization, not of his enemies, but of his former connections. To function as a Viltrumite again, Nolan had to psychologically reduce his human family from people he loved to obstacles to overcome. This isn't sociopathy. It's a survival mechanism his mind created to resolve unbearable internal conflict. Watch how he speaks to Mark during their confrontations. He doesn't deny their connection. That would be too painful. Instead, he reframes it as a temporary weakness he's overcome, a necessary phase in his development that he's now moved beyond. This allows him to maintain his self-image as a caring father while simultaneously preparing to eliminate everything his caring once protected. The truly disturbing aspect isn't that Nolan became cruel. It's that he remained, in his own mind, fundamentally reasonable. Every action, every justification, every calculated choice was made by someone who genuinely believed he was doing the right thing for the greater good. But the real monster wasn't his cruelty. It was his absolute certainty that he was right. There comes a moment in every transformation when the person you were can no longer coexist with who you were becoming. For Nolan Grayson, that moment arrived when he had to choose between his mission and his son's life, and his choice revealed something terrifying about the nature of conditional love. The psychological literature calls this moral flexibility under stress, but what happened to Nolan goes deeper. When he dragged Mark through buildings, causing collateral damage that would have horrified him months earlier, he wasn't acting out of anger or loss of control. He was demonstrating the ultimate expression of utilitarian thinking, the ends justifying any means necessary. But here's what makes it psychologically fascinating. Nolan genuinely believed he was saving Mark. In his restructured moral framework, forcing his son to witness and participate in humanity's subjugation wasn't cruelty. It was education. He was trying to spare Mark the psychological torment he himself had endured by showing him the truth about human insignificance. This reflects what psychologists call narcissistic empathy, the ability to feel for others, but only through the lens of your own worldview. Nolan could feel Mark's pain, but he interpreted that pain as growing pains, necessary suffering that would ultimately lead to enlightenment. Like a parent forcing a child to get vaccinated, he saw himself as doing something painful but necessary for Mark's own good. The civilians caught in their battle weren't real to him anymore. They had become what military psychologists call acceptable losses, statistical necessities in service of a greater purpose. This psychological distancing allowed him to cause massive destruction while maintaining his self-image as someone acting out of love and necessity. What's most chilling is how he maintained emotional connection while committing acts of mass violence. He wasn't a mindless monster or a cold sociopath. He was a father trying to teach his son a lesson about reality, even if that lesson required destroying everything the son had previously valued. This creates an almost impossible psychological paradox. How do you fight someone who genuinely loves you while simultaneously being willing to eliminate you for your own good? How do you reason with absolute certainty wrapped in genuine affection? The answer is you don't, because at that point, love itself has become a weapon. What we witnessed in Omni-Man's psychology isn't fiction. It's a masterclass in how intelligent, caring individuals can become architects of systematic harm while maintaining their fundamental humanity. The scariest part isn't that he became a monster. It's that he remained recognizably human throughout his transformation. Research in moral psychology shows us that the most dangerous individuals aren't psychopaths who lack empathy. They are people with intact emotional systems who well learn to redirect their compassion in service of harmful ideologies. Nolan demonstrates what psychologists call bounded empathy, the ability to feel deeply for some while completely devaluing others. Studies of historical figures who committed massive atrocities consistently show this pattern. They were often loving family members, devoted friends, and genuine believers in their cause. The Milgram experiments proved that ordinary people will inflict severe harm when convinced they are serving a greater good and when responsibility is diffused through authority structures. Nolan's Viltrumite conditioning created what we recognize as system justification, a psychological tendency to defend and rationalize the status quo, even when that system causes suffering. He genuinely believed that Viltrumite rule, despite its costs, represented the best possible outcome for the universe. This wasn't delusion. It was the logical conclusion of his cultural programming. The neurological research on moral decision-making shows us that when people face extreme moral conflicts, their brains literally rewire themselves to reduce psychological stress. Nolan's mind didn't break under the pressure of choosing between his family and his people. It adapted by creating new neural pathways that allowed both loyalties to coexist through careful compartmentalization. What makes this particularly relevant is how it mirrors real-world examples of ordinary people who become complicit in systematic harm. From corporate executives who knowingly sell dangerous products to bureaucrats who implement harmful policies, the psychological mechanisms are identical: moral disengagement, euphemistic labeling, and the gradual expansion of acceptable harm in service of perceived greater goods. The truly disturbing realization is that Nolan's transformation wasn't pathological. It was entirely rational within his belief system. He wasn't calculating coldly. He was calculating compassionately, trying to minimize total suffering by accepting necessary losses. This wasn't madness. It was the terrifying logic of absolute moral certainty combined with unlimited power. In the end, the most lasting damage from Omni-Man's choices was not the physical destruction. It was the psychological aftermath that rippled through every relationship he'd ever formed. The true horror of his transformation lies not in what he destroyed, but in what he revealed about the fragility of trust and the conditional nature of love. Mark's trauma wasn't just about witnessing violence. It was about discovering that everything he believed about his father, his family, and himself had been built on a foundation that could crumble without warning. This is what psychologists call foundational betrayal. When someone fundamental to your identity reveals themselves to be entirely different from who you believe them to be, Debbie, a psychological journey represents something even more complex. The grief of loving someone who still exists but has become unrecognizable. She wasn't mourning Nolan's elimination. She was mourning the death of the person she thought she'd married, while that person's body continued to exist in an alien form. This ambiguous loss creates a unique type of psychological torment that standard grief counseling can't address. But perhaps the most disturbing legacy is what Nolan's story reveals about the nature of moral systems themselves. His transformation demonstrates that no ethical framework is immune to corruption when it encounters absolute power and systematic dehumanization. The most caring parents, the most dedicated protectors, the most principled individuals can all be reshaped under the right psychological pressures. The scientific literature on moral development shows us that ethical reasoning isn't fixed. It's contextual, malleable, and heavily influenced by group dynamics and authority structures. What we consider universal moral truths are actually learned responses that can be unlearned under extreme circumstances. Nolan's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. How many of our own moral certainties are actually conditional? How much pressure would it take to transform our deepest convictions into their opposites? The research suggests that the answer might be less than we'd like to believe. The most chilling aspect of his character isn't his power or his choices. It's how recognizably human he remains throughout his transformation. He represents the terrifying possibility that evil isn't something foreign that invades good people. It's something that good people can become when their moral frameworks are systematically restructured. In the end, Omni-Man's greatest victory wasn't conquering Earth. It was proving that anyone, given the right conditions, could make the same choices he did. And perhaps that's the most unsettling legacy of all. The most terrifying villains aren't those who abandon their humanity. They're those who retain it while redefining what humanity means. Omni-Man didn't lose his capacity for love. He learned to love selectively. He didn't abandon his moral compass. He recalibrated it to serve a different true north. In the end, he remains the most dangerous type of antagonist, one who genuinely believes he's the hero of his own story. And maybe, in the twisted logic of his reconstructed morality, he actually is.